So what we're here to talk about is uniform itself. Right. This is fashion month. And the thing that keeps coming up for me about uniforms is that they are they represent both the promise and peril of unity and uniformity, right? Like when it's your side running onto the pitch, the uniform creates the superorganism, the collective individual that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? But when it's like the stormtroopers of the bad guys, the uniform like absolves the individuals of moral culpability for their actions, and they become the embodiment of the impersonal force that they represent.
Totally.
So my question for you is, what makes a uniform good or bad, morally speaking?
Whew. I mean, as a Leeds United fan, I would say that the amount of red that's in it is basically.
Well, yeah. I mean, as an Atlanta United fan, I tend to agree.
Really? Like those stripes are intimidating, right?
Yes.
Right? And the
I love
black
that
is also. Ooh, that's very interesting. And I'm going to answer your question eventually, but like, how does that make you feel about like the morality or the moral culpability of that uniform? That it has an intimidating quality to it.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, now we have to talk about place, because we have to talk about Atlanta, and Atlanta has a lot of red. The Hawks wear red. The Braves have red. The Braves have an all red shirt that they wear sometimes, and the Falcons are red and black too. Like it's like like the sports culture of this place is intimidating. And here's the thing, I think that Atlanta is a very has always been, but remains in a way, a very divided place culturally. And there are multiple cultures. There are multiple sports cultures. There are, to use American shorthand vernacular, white cultures and black cultures. And the significance of intimidating force in the uniform means very different things on either side of that division. And what I like about it is the tension, I think, between those.
Interesting. Very interesting. I mean, like, to go back to your question about moral culpability, I mean, I think that the colors red and black tend to be associated with like animals which like to protect themselves by displaying force, right? Mm-hmm. And we tend to associate force with, like I'd say, like as dissidents, as heretics, I'd say we tend to associate force with authority, which tends to be misused. Uh-huh. So I think color is like one of those things. I think collars are one of those things. I think, like, honestly, anything which evokes the police, for me, is one of those things.
Police wear blue.
Yes, but they also have, like they have regalia, let's say. That's true. Like the fit. Oh, like, cops tend to, perhaps, like, because of diets which are heavy on sugars and carbohydrates and icing, tend to have very, tight-fitting costumes. I'd say, like, we're talking about soccer, right, a lot of the time. Those uniforms have gotten, for functional reasons, tighter. So I think they tend to evoke moral, bad morality for me.
Something that just occurred to me talking about cops is that the cops don't pick their uniforms, right? Like, elected civilians pick their uniforms, and so they don't want them to look terrifying. Although, like, certain departments and certain jurisdictions do want their cops to look terrifying. And so it's, something that strikes me, like, driving around on highways of Georgia is when like the difference between municipal police and county sheriffs and state troopers in terms of how terrifying their uniforms are. And that basically goes in ascending order of terrifying. Like Atlanta police are terrifying, but like the county sheriff, yeah, that's the you don't
more.
want. Yeah. You
That's
don't
so
want to mess with
interesting.
those guys.
That really messes with my idea of like what the purview of a sheriff is. Like I've always thought of sheriffs as having to be like more representative of the people of the place that they represent. Whereas, right?
Well, that is functionally politically true in the abstract, but the difference is by state. And to some different states, it depends how empowered counties are, basically. And like Georgia has very powerful counties and a very powerful state apparatus. And like the thing that I tend to find basically is like the state troopers are like the imperial stormtroopers, right? They're like just faceless jackboots of the governor's power, right? and then like the county sheriff is like the hired bounty hunter who gets to do the dirty work of the stormtroopers without having the white uniform on.
Totally. And with probably a lot more autonomy, but you'd say they're kind of scary in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Interesting. What colors do they wear?
Well, the difference by county, right? So it's the sheriff's. Well, so this is also cars, right? Like it's not just their clothes. Their cars are also part of the uniform. And so the thing, it's when I start to see all black cars that I start to get worried. Because those are the ones who are hiding, right? Like trying to sneak up on you. And then like the uniforms of the sheriffs are usually pretty dark gray and black also, and maybe sometimes brown. They're a little bit more military as opposed to, sort of like, blue, like civil colored. I don't know.
Totally. Like khaki adjacent.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So how do you feel like the divisiveness of, I was going to say like the Coca-Cola culture of Atlanta, just to get a little bit of a, like, more red. How do you feel like, that contributes to, like the intimidation factor, like this need for the teams of Atlanta to intimidate other teams?
Well, so I think it's pretty amazing that we ended up talking about law enforcement so quickly when we started talking about sports. And one thing I mentioned about the sports culture here is like how, racially segregated a place this was officially for a long time and remains de facto in all those ways. Then of course there's like this the tension between like sports as the unifying force. Like the white people in Atlanta would like to believe that sports is this unifying force that transcends all whatever. That's surely not how it is for the majority of Atlanta sports fans. But the way that plays differently, is so important there. And like the culture, something that you cannot deny about going to a game at any of the stadiums in Atlanta, even the Brave Stadium, which has moved from being downtown as like the people's place to like up 75 into white flight territory in the last 10 years. Even still, like hip hop is the dominant music of these events, of course, because this is Atlanta, right? And so like that is the atmosphere into which these sort of like intimidating uniforms are worn, and they feature in music Atlanta sports uniforms have featured in rap music videos for 30 years, right? So it's like I think what I'm saying is that there is an artistic or performative or maybe even like shamanic quality to it that isn't just military the way that I think it is in some sports cultures.
Yeah, I guess like what's kind of coming through for me is that sports culture represents probably black culture more than white culture, even if it's more like co-located with white flag culture, I think is what you called it.
Yes.
And I feel like in that context, the red and black and like the gold for Atlanta, like what's the name of your team? Is it Atlanta United?
The soccer team, right? Yes. Are you dissing us right now?
I mean, I'm an NYCFC fan, so it's a thing. But would you say that in some ways, like it represents black culture more? Black culture has perhaps like taken on as an emblem of like representation. And would you say that like within Atlanta, like Black culture feels like the need to defend itself through like, I'll say like demonstrations of power and intimidation?
I think that it is that question is in a lot of different places, in a lot of different parts of what I might overarchingly refer to as the movement for liberation writ large, right? As everybody is probably aware, at least everybody in the United States, like really major political stakes are like racking the city about like the presence of law enforcement and the sort of racialized like quality of that, despite having like Black mayors, and like it doesn't, like that makes it worse. It's like the militarization of this city by law enforcement and the resistance to that is like a huge undertone for everyone. And so like the flight of the Braves up 75 is clearly just like a let's get away from all of that and just have a good time at the ballpark kind of mentality, at least from the ownership class, right? But that's not, but the different, so there's lots of different movements going on in which put us in very different places on the spectrum, but also like the histories of these teams are so different too. Right. And like the soccer team, Atlanta United is less than 10 years old. Right. So it came to, you asked an interesting question about like justification or defense. I would say that the story, at least the intended story behind Atlanta United, is that it is united. That's right there in the name. The alternating colors are supposed to represent like diversity unified under this gold A, right? That like, that's what brings us all together. Like all the symbolism is overt. This is what like teen literature says about it, right? And so a team that was created in the like Obama era, right? Like actually it wasn't created in the Obama era, it was created in the Trump era. It was created in the post-Obama era. That team is supposed to represent like no longer needing to justify like diversity and integration as the cultural power of Atlanta, right? And like that team behaves, and that team's like marketing and uniforms, they behave as though the team has earned it, right? Like the team has earned the right to use trap music as its pump up music and so forth, right? But like then you put the Braves on the other end of the spectrum. The Braves still have a racist mascot, right? Ooh. And like,
oh yes, the Braves, right?
Yeah, and like the team, like I said, has moved up into this like very white area that's like much harder to get to from downtown, and yet like the star players are still Black, and like it's not like the team has not escaped this dynamic here.
Totally.
So yeah, it's a very overt, and I don't know anything about football, unfortunately, for 90% of the sports fans in Atlanta, so I can't really speak to that side of it. But I imagine it's pretty rough over there too.
Yeah, I mean, like, what kind of came up for me when you were talking about the Braves, and like again, like I'm not, like I only listen to music from Atlanta, but it almost sets up this dynamic where the people who wear the uniform may not feel represented by what they're wearing. Whether it's because the uniform evokes like policing symbology, or whether it's because of where they're playing, and like the overreach, let's say, by like that culture into the culture that's maybe represented by the players and even like some of the historic fan base.
Yeah.
And I guess kind of what comes up for me is like how uniforms can like obscure I'll say like identity, even though that's like a fairly like distorted term, or like like authenticity. Yet they can also like represent authenticity. They can represent like the urge of a movement, right? And then also I think like you have that like added dimension of like dualism, let's call it, where like what the colors and the symbolism and even like the fit represent for like one faction can come across wildly differently for people outside of that team, and indeed like the opposite team. And I feel like this is all like really fascinating for me, like in the context of fashion, which I tend to talk about as like communication. It's a medium, right?
Sure.
And I can't wait to listen to the other episodes that you've got lined up for this. But yeah, I mean, do you feel like with uniform that the communicational payload is more difficult given like that duality? Like you're trying to say something to the people who wear it and the people who don't wear it.
Yes. Oh, that's so true. And the, and I was thinking about that earlier in terms of blue police uniforms, right? That like if the police were dressed in red and black, I think it would be pretty unambiguous what their job is, right? Whereas they're supposed to look like they're protecting and serving or whatnot. So they dress them they dress them like postal workers with guns on their hips. So like the duality is very hard to communicate about, and I think that there's home and away uniforms too, right? Like that's something that I've always thought a lot about, especially as a baseball fan, where like it seemed, at least when I was a kid, it seemed like there were conventions, like league-wide conventions of just like white is home and gray is away. And that's really starting to change. Or it's probably changed a long time ago. And there's all kinds of different other colors now. But that binary never really worked for me, even as a kid. Like it just didn't feel like they were distinct enough. There was enough culture behind the idea that like these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and based on where they are, which one you're supposed to be cheering for. There needs to be some third element beyond the duality, right? There needs to be some, and like the mascot can serve that purpose to some extent. But I was talking to our mutual friend Jerry when we were at a soccer game last weekend, and we were talking about how many soccer teams are just named after the place, or just so and so FC or whatever, and how they're lacking in like tigers and gargoyles and stuff. Like they could have more character than that. And I was just really playing with that tension between like character and place, where like as a fan, as a supporter of a team that is like that, well, we both are actually, like the place the place itself has to be the character, the third thing that's different from either like good or bad.
Totally. I mean, I feel like both the teams that we support in MLS, just to make it like local, have done really good jobs of their branding.
Yes.
Like I would say that, like hearing what you feel like Atlanta United are trying to represent with their, I'm going to call it costume just to give you a little bit of shit.
Yes.
I'd say like they've done a pretty good job. And it sounds like internally they've done a pretty good job too. I'm thinking about NYCFC, and they do look like cops.
Yeah, they do.
To an extent.
New York's finest.
And we have a fan base which is like, I would say like fairly hostile to cops. And there are elements there which I think also sort of like indicate that they're not police, which is very interesting. So, like I was just talking about how it's a difficult like communicational payload, but I feel like both of those teams have done really well. I think both of those teams hired like very well reputed designers. And I guess like, like what you were saying about like the norms in baseball, definitely not the case in football or soccer, where, like those color norms don't necessarily apply. And I'm just kind of like tuning into like what it is about like playing home and playing away, and like what kind of design constraints that places on the people who are designing these uniforms. I mean, like you mentioned, like good and bad. And I think that's really interesting. I think I'd be very hard pressed to think that like red or black could like, absent of context, imply like goodness to like any fan base, right? But I think sense of place is probably like something that's worth bringing up, right? Like maybe it's something that isn't understood by visiting fans or people watching on TV, neutrals, but because you're there and you understand the context of what that color means to the people of the city, the fact that like they understand it and outsiders don't understand it is in itself, I would say, like context appropriate communication.